But she was an example. Like today, think about yourself. Let's think about ourselves for a moment. How do we honor Jesus? Do we give him our all? Even just do we give him our time? Do we give him some time in the mornings or throughout the day? Hey, sister, to commemorate this week, Good Friday and Easter Sunday, I want to read from the book, Do You See This Woman? Jesus and the Women of the Gospels. This is from Mary of Bethany Anoints Jesus, the chapter about, of course, Jesus anointing by Mary, a very, very special story which you may already be familiar with, and it is found in John chapter 12. This is after Lazarus, sometime after, and probably not long after Lazarus was raised from the dead by Jesus. And I want to read to you this part of the chapter that really helps you visualize what was happening. This book, by the way, you can get it on ipibooks.com. And this book is by Chelsea Novak and Dr. Steve Kennard, in case you want to get a copy. Here we go. Mary stood at the door of the banquet hall. She wore a blue stola with gold trim, and her black hair was tucked inside an off-white head covering trimmed with blue. She clasped an object in her hands. Mary paused and exhaled a long breath. Then she entered the large banquet hall, where a long granite table ran down the center of the floor. The table stood about a cubit above the stone floor. The floor was covered with elaborate carpets from Persia and soft billowing pillows from Greece. The pillows were stuffed with feathers, reeds, and straw. Men in drab robes and unwashed tunics reclined at the table. Some reclined on their left and some on their right. Their arms reached across the table for stuffed grape leaves and pickled artichokes. The banquet had begun at sunset. Mary was quite late. Laughter and stories and news of the latest events in Jerusalem filled the hall. The aroma of roasted lamb and baked pita and olive oil wafted through the air. As Mary entered the hall, the laughter stopped. Silence filled the room. All eyes focused on her. Martha, Mary's sister, had been serving the guests. Martha paused. Oh, what now, Mary? She thought. Lazarus, Mary and Martha's brother, was reclining at the table. He held a goblet of wine in his hand. He placed the goblet on the table. The clink of clay on granite broke the silence for a moment. What now, Mary? Lazarus thought. Martha was beside Lazarus as Mary entered the room. Lazarus made room for Martha to sit next to him. Martha sighed as she sat. Mary circled the table toward Martha and Lazarus, carrying something. All the guests craned at their necks to see what was in Mary's hands. That's an alabaster jar, one guest whispered. Egyptian alabaster, murmured another. Judas snickered under his breath. How could Mary afford such a jar? Only the wealthiest guests in the room understood the cost of alabaster jars. None of them owned one. Mary continued to walk. When she arrived beside her sister and brother, she smiled and bowed. Then she kept walking. Mary stopped beside her teacher, Jesus. Jesus' head was next to Lazarus, but his feet and legs were stretched far away from the table. Jesus looked up at Mary. He smiled. Mary smiled back. Mary took another step and knelt by Jesus' feet. Jesus lifted himself higher on his elbow and turned his head to look at Mary. Mary's eyes darted to Jesus' feet. Martha leaned her head towards Lazarus. What is she doing? She whispered. I have no idea, Lazarus whispered back. A large, rotund man reclined on the other side of Jesus. Pita crumbs were encrusted in the oil of his beard. He made room for Mary to sit. He was careful not to touch this woman. He didn't know Mary, but he heard of the rumors. She considered herself a disciple of the rabbi. At first, the man gave Mary an inquisitive look, thinking, Mary, what are you doing? Why are you here? But as she knelt on his vacated pillow, his look turned hard, and he thought, how dare you take my place at the table? Mary was oblivious. She blocked out the stares of the men and the whispers of Martha and Lazarus. To Mary, the room was empty, except for her and her teacher. There was a burgundy pillow with gold threading lying beside the table. Mary took the pillow and slid it under Jesus' feet. She opened the alabaster jar. She opened it carefully. The jar was expensive and could be used again. Only Mary knew that this was the same jar she used to anoint Lazarus for burial. Even her sister Martha didn't know this detail. Mary was secretive that way. After opening the jar, Mary poured the thick oil on Jesus' feet. The aroma of the perfume oil was unmistakable. "That is nard of the highest quality," whispered one guest who was an alchemist and perfumer by trade. "It must have been imported from India," said another guest under his breath. "My family could live for a year on what she just spilled on his feet," said another guest in a muted undertone. Judas sneered but saved his voice. The fragrance of the nard filled the banquet hall, overwhelming and enveloping the sense of lamb and pita. The room took on the smell of a funeral instead of a banquet. One guest rose to leave, but he stopped when he saw Mary reach to remove her head covering. Mary's hair was dark as a raven. It tumbled around her shoulders and down her back to her waist. Mary never cut her hair. She took the ends of her hair and wiped the oil across Jesus' feet. She was careful to wipe the oil around the edges and sole of his feet. Much of the oil dripped onto the maroon pillow, staining the cloth. The dark spots on the pillow looked like blood. Martha was incredulous. She shook her head and murmured, "Mary, Mary." Mary continued to wipe Jesus' feet with her long flowing hair. The aroma of nard drifted in the air. Judas had seen enough. He stood and threw his cloth napkin on the stone table, toppling 2 great goblets with one throw. His lips were pursed, his temper pulsed with anger. He darted his eyes to Jesus and then to Lazarus and Mary. His gaze settled on Jesus. He stared directly at the teacher. "Why?" he exclaimed. "Why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" Lazarus looked away. He had no answer. He could not defend his sister's action. For all he knew, Mary had just poured the family's savings on Jesus' feet. The tension in the room was palpable. Mary continued to wipe Jesus' feet. She knew the answer to the question. She knew why. She had been listening carefully to her teacher for weeks and months. She had picked up on subtle nuances of Jesus' teaching. What everyone else seemed to have missed, Mary understood. She knew the importance of this Passover. She knew this would be the last Passover she would celebrate with Jesus. She continued to wipe Jesus' feet with her hair. A familiar voice broke the silence. It was the voice of the teacher. "Leave her alone," Jesus said. Jesus paused and looked at Judas. Judas cowered, then sat down. Jesus looked around the room. "She did this to prepare for the day of my burial. You will always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me." Mary smiled. Her teacher understood her. No one else understood her, but that didn't matter to Mary. Jesus understood her. Jesus rose from the table. He looked at Mary, who was kneeling at his feet. He reached down and took her hand. He pulled her up beside him. "Thank you, Mary," Jesus said. "Why is it that in every situation you seem to be at my feet?" He chuckled. "Walk beside me." Jesus took a step toward the door. Mary remained silent. She closed the alabaster jar. More perfume remained. Maybe she would have the opportunity to use the remaining oil in the future. She stepped beside Jesus. Jesus walked to the exit with Mary beside him. At the door, he turned and said, "Thank you, Martha and Lazarus, for your hospitality. Shalom." Mary smiled at her brother and sister. Jesus left the room with Mary at his side. And then the rest of the disciples rose one by one and exited behind Jesus and Mary. The last to leave was Judas. Mary is prophetic. Without using her voice, she is prophetic in her gesture of anointing Jesus for burial. There are women in the Bible like Huldah and Anna who are noted for being prophets. There are other women in the Bible like Elizabeth, Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus, who were prophetic in action. Mary saw what others did not see and understood what others failed to understand. She had deduced from sitting at Jesus' feet and listened to his teaching that this next Passover, 6 days away, would be Jesus' last Passover. He would die. The banquet in Bethany might be her only opportunity to honor him and prepare him for burial. So she made the most of the opportunity. Mary's action was prophetic. Jesus got it. He understood it, and he let everyone else in on why Mary had anointed him. Jesus gave Mary credit for what she did. Mary is bold. She breaks social convention to perform her prophetic action. This is the nature of prophets. They resist the opposition of the status quo and stand against the stale conformity of institutional leaders. They are devoted to a higher call and respond to a voice that is on a pitch that most people can't hear. Mary boldly enters a circle of men and pours an expensive ointment on Jesus' feet. Then she bravely lets down her hair and uses it to wipe the oil across the feet of Jesus. Mary creates a scene. In a good way, she is scandalous. She produces a scandal that people have been discussing for 2,000 years. During a time when people are jaded and stuck in their ways, sometimes the only way to get a reaction from them is to start a commotion. That is what the late U.S. Congressman John Lewis called good trouble. That is what Jesus did. Jesus created good trouble. He not only predicted the destruction of the temple, but he also cleared the money changers from the temple court with a whip that generated a scandal that led to Jesus dying on the cross. Then his cross became a scandal to the Jews and foolishness to the Gentiles. Prophets are scandalous, and Mary was scandalous in a good way. She did not care what her family or other disciples or the other villagers thought or said about her. She saw Jesus. She wanted to honor him before his death. Mary's actions were extravagant because she had an extravagant love for Jesus. Her actions show us that there is a place for extravagant acts of devotion. Rachel Held Evans writes about Mary, noting, in a culture in which a woman's touch was often forbidden, Mary dares to cradle the feet of Jesus in her hands and spread the oil across his ankles and toes with the ends of her hair. She's all in, fully committed, sparing no expense. The oil she may have been reserving for her own burial or the burial of a loved one had been poured out generously without thought of the future. Here we are, almost 2,000 years after the event of Mary and her prophetic act of anointing Jesus with oil, and we are still talking and thinking about her. Mary stands as a testimony of the deep and lasting impact of one solitary life lived in complete and total devotion to Jesus. Mary is yet another woman in the gospel who has no voice. Judas speaks, Jesus speaks, but Mary has no voice, except Mary speaks through her actions, and her actions speak louder and more precisely than a voice. Without a voice, Mary has been speaking to the followers of Jesus for 2,000 years. Her voiceless voice is heard anywhere the gospel is preached. Wow. This is such a reminder of the boldness that we need to have for Jesus. That good scandal, like the book says, right? Good scandal, as long as it's honoring Jesus. It's amazing. It also reminds us of how when Jesus took out the whip and remember when Jesus took out the whip and he was overturning the tables because people were dishonoring God's temple by selling things there. It was right on the grounds of the temple, which is very dishonoring. That was bold. That made people upset, right? And isn't it something how money is connected to all of this? A lot of this, people get upset about money. Judas was protesting. Well, she could have given it to the poor, but Judas was stealing. We know that later about Judas. At that moment, nobody really knew that. But he was stealing and he betrayed Jesus, but he was the one protesting that. And other people were thinking it. We know that. If I were there, I would think that too. Let's be honest. If I didn't see it in the way Mary did, I didn't see through spiritual lens, I would be like, oh my gosh, what are you doing, girl? That perfume's expensive. Why? I think about our offerings to Jesus, our offerings to God, what we give. Also, think about it. Do we give our best? Do we give our best, and also monetarily, to contributions in the church, to others, people who need, even to the poor? Yes, to all that is very, very important. How do we think about our money? How do we think about our possessions? do we give it all up for Jesus? And Mary did that. Like, I don't know how she saved all this money. I mean, that is a big question that I will have in my head, and that's not answered. But she clearly spent some really good amount of money. And where it came from, I don't know, but it was either hers or hers and the family's or something or the other. Like she had to have access to this money. So she gave that up to prepare Jesus for his burial, to honor Jesus. And then she takes off her veil from her head covering, and which is already scandalous because you're not supposed to do that in front of other men. And there's a whole culture thing and Jewish culture and all that. So that's also another thing she did. Like, but she was an example. Like today, think about yourself. Let's think about ourselves for a moment. How do we honor Jesus? Do we give him our all? Even just do we give him our time? Do we give him some time in the mornings or throughout the day? Or do we give it to someone else or to something else or to technology or other distractions or things that are not important? I can preach to myself first right here. I struggle with that, my sister. I'm not perfect in any means. Like I still battle with these things. And I preach to myself first. How much are we honoring Jesus? And Mary is such a good example. Like Mary was a good example at the feet of Jesus. Last episode, Mary was, she was emotional. She couldn't go to Jesus without help from Martha. We heard that in the last episode. And if you didn't hear that, I encourage you to hear that episode, my sisters, the last one I put out for the month of March. And as we do this first episode for April, and I did this story. I was gonna finish the book in March, and I was like, I'm gonna move on to something else. But I said, no, I have to tell this story one more time in this book, especially now that we're going to be going into this week of Good Friday and Easter Sunday and Passover, of course, and just the celebration of life of Jesus and what he did for us, and the reason why you and I are here, are saved, have a relationship with him. So let's think about that, ponder upon that, and let's follow her example. Okay, my sister? All right. So I hope that you enjoyed this episode, and I encourage you to go to my website, theintentionalchristianwoman.com, for all kinds of goodness. I have really good stuff in there for you. Check it out, explore it. I would love to be able to give you some gifts that I made for you, and know that I love you, know that I'm praying for you, and I will see you in the next episode. Sister, I truly pray that this episode has blessed you and has encouraged your heart today. If it did, would you share it with a friend? Also, would you leave me a review? Not only do I love reading my reviews, the reviews actually help the show be found by others who could use the encouragement. And if you want more resources that could help your walk with God, simply visit theintentionalchristianwoman.com. You'll find all kinds of goodness in there. Sister, know that I love you and I am praying for you, and I will see you in the next episode.